Good afternoon, everyone, or good day. I'm actually not sure when exactly you're going to be hearing this. I'm Mike Rothman, president of Securosis, and I could not be happier to be here today talking about building a threat intelligence program. We are going to really run you through a lot of the key aspects of what threat intelligence is, how it can help you, and really how to systematize that into a program that makes sense. I would like to obviously thank our benefactor here, LookingGlass Cyber Solutions. So again, these two dashingly handsome guys will lead you through the discussion over the next 45 minutes to an hour. So as I mentioned, I'm Mike Rothman with Securosis, and I'm pleased to be with A.J. Shipley, who is Vice President of Products for LookingGlass. So again, we're going to have a fun, interactive discussion, and that's what we're going to try to do. We're going to make it a little bit different than your typical talking head webcast where one person talks to themselves for 30 minutes, the other person talks to themselves for 15 minutes. AJ and I are old pals. We've known each other for a while, so I think that having more of an interchange and interactive discussion will be certainly a lot more fun for us and hopefully a lot more beneficial for you. So before we kind of jump into the subject matter, let me explain a little bit about who and what Securosis is. So we're independent analysts. We're a small research boutique. We only focus on information security. That's all we do. We're all 20-plus year practitioners, analysts, vendors, etc. We all have a background in both doing, selling, positioning, etc. So we've kind of seen it all. We've done it all. We've messed up a lot of it, and what we try to do is distill a lot of what we learned through the years, leverage a proprietary network of contacts that we have in order to really deliver impactful research to help organizations make decisions relative to their critical data and information protection aspects a lot faster, a lot better, a lot more effectively. And again, we are security folks. That's all we do. We're passionate about it. And with that, AJ, why don't you tell us a little bit about LookingGlass before we jump in?
Great. Yeah, thanks, Mike. And like you, I'm very excited to be here. Really looking forward to this this conversation. I've been looking forward to it now since we got it on the books. So thank you. Briefly, so LookingGlass Cyber Solutions, we're a cyber threat intelligence company that delivers comprehensive threat intelligence-driven security, really through our entire solution portfolio that consists of machine-readable threat intelligence. We have several threat intelligence management platforms, network-based threat mitigation appliances, and backed by a relatively large and deeply experienced and set of expert threat intelligence services. We look at threats really across structured indicators of compromise, unstructured and open source data correlated with internal network telemetry that our customers have collected through their existing capabilities, and really use all of that to give our customers unprecedented understanding really of the threats that may be impacting their business, including not just cyber threats but also threats to their physical assets, their third-party partners, their brand, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a little bit about LookingGlass.
Great. Thanks, man. So let's jump in. And just so you understand, all you listeners out there, the context for a lot of the content that we will present, Securosis recently did a research initiative that was really about building a threat intelligence program. And what we've seen, and we've really tracked this whole space for actually almost as long as it's been a thing, right? So that's a couple of years at this point. And what we kind of realized is that a lot of folks, and we'll get into this, but a lot of folks have had a very tactical view of threat intelligence, and it was really time to build it into a core, systematic, programmatic effort that really underlies and underpins a lot of the security processes that have been ongoing for a long time. So really the main question, and what really drives folks to think about threat intelligence is right here, right? How do you deal with an attack that you've never seen? And whether you want to call it a 0-day, whether you want to call it an advanced attack, whether you want to call it APT, I mean, whatever you want and whatever vernacular you think is appropriate, at the end of the day, what a lot of security had been based on for a good portion of the 15 plus, 20 plus years that certainly I've been in the security space has really been about looking for stuff that you know is bad. And obviously, as adversaries have gotten more sophisticated, as the attackers have gotten better at what they do, they tend not to use the same stuff, or they have different ways of manipulating the attack so that it looks different. So a lot of our old school controls like antivirus, like intrusion detection and prevention, well, they're just not as effective anymore because the attacks kind of look different. So what we got excited about a couple of years was about this concept of benefiting from the misfortune of others. So this is basically an arbitrage play, right? It's making an assumption that your organization is not going to be the only organization hit by attacks. And in fact, unless you are a very high profile type of organization, typically, kind of governmental or Fortune 10 financial, or somebody with very heavy and very valuable intellectual property, you're probably not going to be the first to get attacked with very sophisticated malicious software. So what that does is that provides an opportunity for you to learn from the wisdom of others, for you to leverage kind of large networks of folks that are starting to more increasingly share what it is that they've learned, and really, again, kind of joking, a little jokey thing here with the meme, but the reality is most attacks that are successful out there have been seen before, and in many cases there are workarounds, if not patches, for what it is. So this general concept of threat intelligence is to, again, leverage the fact that somebody else has seen this attack, which means you have a much greater likelihood of finding it if you know what to look for, because as I said earlier on, a lot of the underpinnings of what it is that we do from a security standpoint is looking for things that we know are bad, and that allows us to, again, try to get out ahead of it. So threat intelligence to the rescue. So how did we get threat intelligence integrated into our general processes, right? So were you about to say something, AJ? Oh, okay, go. So, this idea of tactical threat intelligence is pretty straightforward, right? Get hit with an attack, ask your threat intelligence vendor whether they've seen something, buy the data, pump it into your monitors, repeat. Right? So what we're not doing is getting out ahead of it, right? We're not more strategically using threat intelligence as a way to, I don't want to say preemptively, because that may be a little bit excessive, but certainly pseudo-proactively leverage what other folks have learned, especially folks that are hit by very sophisticated malware, which gives us a little ability to narrow our aperture a bit on attacks that are out there in the wild being used right now. So again, the way it usually works is you'd look for a bad file, somebody would find it, you'd already be compromised all over the place, you'd wait for your antivirus to update, and then you wouldn't get hit by that file again. But it really does tip the scales a little bit, or at least balance the scales a little bit in what had been a very unbalanced environment, to be able to actually look for things that are being used in the wild, to look for things that are actually being used out there to compromise devices. And if you're looking for these things or putting in place proactive workarounds, again, you're really reducing your attack surface, making the adversaries work a lot harder to compromise your devices. So threat intelligence can really be used in a lot of different aspects, and we describe all of this in the paper. But here are, kind of at least three of the big ones that we tend to see in organizations. Security monitoring being first and foremost, right? And that's this idea that I'm looking at telemetry, I'm looking at data, maybe it's in a SIM, maybe it's in some type of intrusion prevention device, maybe it's just within my endpoint platform, what have you. And what we're doing is leveraging these new, I don't want to call them signatures, but attack patterns to look for signs of these new attacks that we haven't seen before. So again, and obviously within our SIM, we can look for these kinds of attacks as well, if not in a separate threat intelligence platform, which I know AJ will talk about in a few minutes. So this first idea is that we are enriching the data that we are monitoring from a security context with real patterns of attacks that we're seeing in the wild. So let's say that, like almost everything else, we're not able to prevent everything, which we're not, right? So detection and response has certainly been an area of focus for many large enterprises, almost every large enterprise. And we can also supplement our data with threat intelligence information, external threat intelligence information to great degree if we are in a response type of function. So that would look like we have an attack, we have to start investigating it, and then what we're able to do with the threat intelligence is to, one, understand who typically is behind it. That adversary information is going to give us some clues in terms of what their tactics are, possibly what their motives are, and certainly give us a much greater view of the malware that these adversaries typically use, so that, again, I'm not first starting to, do some Google foo and try to figure out what this attack looks like and what it actually does. You already know all of that based upon the adversary, based upon the indicators that you find within your monitor. So incident response is a key aspect of that as well. And then the third use case that we see very prevalent within organizations is this idea of supplementing our active controls. We usually see this in terms of malicious sites. So what we'll do is on our egress filters, we'll start looking for these malicious sites, whether they're command and control environments, whether we know that they are malicious sites that are up to no good, whether they're hosted by hosting providers that we know tend to be malicious. What we can do is start more actively blocking traffic to those devices, or certainly alerting with a pretty high priority of the fact that, hey, we know this device is communicating with a place that we know tends to do some pretty bad stuff. So if we're not going to get out ahead of it by blocking it, what we should do is at least bubble that alert up to the top so that somebody can start at least monitoring that device, because that would be a pretty clear indication that something funky is going on with that. So the benefits, obviously detecting the attacks earlier and looking for these attack patterns identified in other environments. Remember, benefiting from the misfortune of others. Somebody else has gotten attacked, boo-hoo. We certainly feel bad for them, and we have empathy for them, but at the end of the day, we can benefit from that because those attacks will be used over and over again by the adversaries as the very sophisticated malware tending to be used by nation states gets commoditized pretty quickly in today's environment. So we talked about the tactics and how you use threat intel, or how threat intel tends to be used in a very tactical fashion. We also talked about the specific use cases, but what we haven't really built the need for is why we need to systematize a lot of this environment. Because remember, if we're not in a situation where we're trying to execute on a consistent set of behaviors, we're just kind of going through our life willy-nilly, right? And I think that a lot of security folks have done this for many years. Right? We have not kind of gotten into a place where we are strategically acting based upon what we know we need to do. And anytime we have a new control, anytime we have a new capability, we tend to just throw it into the mix and see what happens. But I think we're comfortable enough with threat intelligence. We see the value of it enough where it really is time to build it into a much more strategic means, right? A much more leverageable, much more systematic way of using the data or the external threat intelligence within our key use cases. So there are 4 aspects of this program. We'll go into them a little bit, but obviously AJ and I will dig in more specifically in about a minute. But you first start by gathering the threat intelligence, which is what threat intel do I need, right? Who tend to be my adversaries? What information will be most useful to help me find these attacks? How do I use it? That gets into a lot more detail relative to the use cases that I mapped out briefly before. Defining and communicating success, which we will hit. Because again, what we're doing is changing the way we do security, right? We're amending kind of the information that we use to make decisions. And in a lot of cases, that can be different. That can be scary for some folks. So we also have to put our marketing hat on, right? Our technology people are like, what? Marketing? I don't do that. Actually, we do need to do that. And we need to communicate why threat intelligence is important. We need to communicate the value that we're bringing, because not only are we looking to change the process, in many cases we're looking to make a strategic investment in both technology and information, and you do have to market and sell that to a degree. So we'll talk about that a little bit. And then ultimately, you want to pay it back, right? We're benefiting from the misfortune of others, but what we also want to do is make sure that anything that we're learning can be communicated back to the grand network in the sky, the cloud, and make sure that other people can benefit from what's actually happening in our environment. So it really is kind of a you give, you get type of situation, so that everybody can really benefit from this shared experience. Because at the end of the day, the enemy is not the folks that are trying to work to defend ourselves, or even your competitors. The enemy really is the adversary, and we're going to have to work together to make that a lot more effective relative to our ability to stop these folks. So we'll dig into all of the different aspects of the program here, but now I think it makes a lot more sense to bring AJ into the discussion and hear a little bit about, again, some of the use cases that LookingGlass is seeing and answering some of these key questions.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Mike. And certainly couldn't agree with you more in terms of the four areas that you called out in terms of how you build a threat intelligence program. Not surprisingly, I think we'll talk specifically about each one of those four areas. We'll bounce kind of back and forth in terms of use cases, as well as collecting information and what you call intelligence, or how it ends up ultimately becoming intelligence. But also sharing, and then really interested in hearing your thoughts and the part about how we communicate success, because I'm glad to hear that you call that up as being a critical aspect of building a comprehensive program. I think I find, and what we're finding is that threat intelligence is a bit buzzwordy sometimes, and I think what people fail to do is they fail to break it down into specific use cases in terms of how it integrates with an organization's existing security controls, right, and processes, because it has to integrate. There have been large investments made, in terms of those existing security controls and the people and the processes to do things like responding to incident response or incidents in an organization, or addressing third-party risk. But it's not, threat intelligence is not something that necessarily stands on its own. It really is about how you sharpen those existing controls. So, if you go to the next slide and you talk about specifically, how our customers use threat intelligence to support incident response, something that's encouraging, and I'm an old, packet head. My career started, back in the networking space at a small networking company called Cisco Systems. What we're seeing is a lot of people using net flow information and starting to collect net flow information, just because of the tremendous amount of visibility that it gives, and insight that it gives into their organization, and what devices are talking to what devices, either from an east-west or from a north-south perspective. And one of the ways that we can really sharpen the use of net flow in the incident response process is to now be able to say, and to your point earlier, we know these locations on the internet are bad, i.e. these IP addresses or these domains that our smart guys have pulled out of domain generation algorithms that we know are associated with specific bot variants, or associated with specific pieces of malware, or IP addresses being used by bulletproof hosting services. We know these locations on the internet are bad neighborhoods, right? And you don't want to visit them, just like there's bad neighborhoods in the real world that you don't want to go visiting. And what you can do with threat intelligence now, as you augment it or use it to augment your net flow collection internally, is we can say very specifically, these internal 192, 168, or 172 addresses on my internal network have been communicating over this period of time with these known bad locations on the public internet. And we know that those locations are either used to host malware, or they're used in phishing attacks, or they are, IP addresses associated with malicious activity, and through that correlation, if you will, and really, LookingGlass, through a combination of our intellectual property that we've built over a number of years, and the data feeds that we bring in, we are able to map the global internet, so we can say immediately, what your network space is, that you're advertising to the rest of the world, as well as the network space that is being used by, different actors, threat actors and groups on the global internet, we're able to now correlate all of that network space external to your organization with all of your internal north-south traffic and identify almost in real time what connections have been made, where that traffic has gone, how much data has flown over what number of connections and over what time period, and really kind of give that full situational awareness now to the incident responder to be able to determine, okay, exactly how many of my assets were compromised, how much of my data has left my organization, and in some cases even give them a starting point of where to go look or who to work with from a local law enforcement perspective in order to go and start to claw some of that data back. So that's an example of how threat intelligence, and specifically this outside-in perspective of the global internet and all of the threats that are targeting organizations, and it could be organizations in your industry or organizations that are part of your supply chain, how that outside-in perspective then correlated with that internal traffic and telemetry that is increasingly starting to be collected by organizations just because of the wealth of information it provides. By providing that correlation, you're able to get a much richer view of the specific activities on your network and unfortunately, when the incidents occur and the data breaches occur, a much richer view of exactly what data has left your organization and where it's gone over what time period.
You bet. So let's kind of dig into this one a little bit, because you'll tend to hear, and I started life as a networking guy too, right? So I kind of still look at things from the standpoint of what does the network tell me, right? I don't believe any of this other stuff. The network is my truth, and a lot of network folks tend to be a little skeptical, right? Security folks too, but we have this list, and obviously when you start blocking traffic, or what happens if a bad neighborhood isn't so bad, right? So are there, kind of things that folks can do to allay any of these fears that, hey, I'm going to block legit traffic, I'm going to, kind of take a business process down because of a characterization of a certain set of IP addresses or a certain set of domains? Because obviously anytime you talk about automation, anytime you talk about, kind of having a Skynet type being making decisions about who I communicate and who I can't, you're going to have, the conspiracy theorists come in and say, oh, I'm not having a machine do that for me. So what do you kind of talk about with customers when they bring up those objections?
Yeah, so we'll talk about this certainly in a couple of slides in terms of how we use threat intelligence and how our customers use threat intelligence to, really improve the efficacy of their blocking or their mitigation solutions. And just kind of to give a little bit of a teaser on that, there's some things that, for example, a domain pulled out of a domain generation algorithm that is 64 characters long and looks like a drunk monkey has been typing on a keyboard, right? They're randomly generated domains. Those things are not locations that any human being, or quite frankly, really any legitimate type of piece of software is likely going to be visiting, right? There's some things that we just know are so bad that you just shouldn't go there. And so being able to pull domains out of domain generation algorithms that are associated with malware that we know will not become active, for maybe 3 days or 3 weeks into the future, and only loading those web proxies or, web gateways or firewalls up in that case with those domains, that's probably a case where automated blocking of locations is okay, because we know that, twofold. A, it's not a legitimate domain just by the fact that it came from a piece of malware and a piece of domain generation algorithm associated with that piece of malware. But B, more importantly, if you don't automate that process, there's no way that a human being could update a rule set, a firewall rule table with a 64-character randomly generated domain, and the chances of typing it in right the first time are pretty slim. But then trying to do that 10,000 or 15,000 or 20,000 times after that for all of the other domains that came out of that domain generation algorithm are next to impossible, probably not the best use of their time. But that would be an example where, preloading certain things that we just know are bad into the devices to block is probably a good thing. But to your point, you can't paint with the same, paintbrush all, indicators of compromise. And so you do have to use some kind of intelligence in terms of deciding, and that's what some of our products do through this notion of threat indicator confidence scoring, give the control back to the analyst to assign a confidence value or a confidence rating to the things, and make a determination about what they want to do with it. What I will say, just to close the thought, is in the cases of incident response, unfortunately, those those mitigation devices have already failed at doing their job, right? Because we've had an incident.
That's right.
And so in the cases of threat intelligence supporting incident response, now at least we can give those responders a leg up in terms of determining exactly what assets have been compromised, exactly what data has been accessed, and where that data has gone and over what time period.
Yep. Okay, good. So third-party risk in supply chain?
Yeah, so here's another example. I kind of alluded to this if you go to the next slide, but so we completed the acquisition of a company called Cyvalence last year, but even before this, this notion of internet intelligence that we have in one of our products where we map the global internet allows us to very quickly determine, hey, what is the public-facing infrastructure that I as an organization am advertising to the rest of the world? And the analogy that I like to use is this is very similar to your house, right? And just like your house has, a set of doors and a set of windows and, maybe a side door coming in from the garage, those entryways into your house, while they are typically locked, right, are going to be the ways that bad guys are going to get into your house if they're going to try to rob it, right? And the public IP space that you advertise, whether it's the cider blocks you own or whether it's the IP addresses or the autonomous system numbers that you're advertising, are analogous to those doors and windows of your house. And so by first and foremost, being able to know, okay, what am I advertising to the rest of the world? And our products allow us to footprint an organization's publicly advertised space, as well as identify, for example, all of the publicly advertised space that another company may be doing business with. So think of the HVAC vendor in the Target breach, right? If Target knew that their HVAC vendor was being targeted by threats, then Target probably could have taken some steps to potentially mitigate any risk to their organization by doing business with that HVAC vendor, but I would argue that they didn't know. Similarly, from an open source perspective, our ability, and this is where Cyvalence comes in, to identify in various surface web, deep web, and dark web forums the things that are being said about organizations or the things that are being communicated between actor groups or individual actors, or the things that are being posted up on paste bin sites like compromised account credentials, not only for an organization that is looking to protect themselves, but also for an organization that does business with a whole bunch of other organizations. And one of our customers use our products almost exclusively to monitor their 3,500 plus vendors in their supply chain. By being able to use threat intelligence, and to your earlier point, attacks are typically not, they're not the first time that an attack has ever been waged. So if a bank has been attacked with a piece of malware, it stands to reason that another bank in the same industry is, if they haven't been targeted yet, they're probably going to be targeted next. And so this is a way that threat intelligence can address third-party risk in supply chain management, either by identifying the network space of the people that you're doing business with and then correlating that with all of the indicators of compromise that we have that intersect with that network space to get out in front of potentially when a vendor of yours has been compromised, so you can take action before those bad guys are able to move laterally into your organization through that compromised vendor, or by being able to monitor all of the open source deep and dark web content, if you will, for what people are saying about who they're going to attack, whether it's you or whether it's somebody in your supply chain or a third party that you do business with. So again, just like we can use threat intelligence, and a number of customers use threat intelligence to get visibility into what threats are attacking them, the very nature of threat intelligence and the fact that it is kind of an outside-in look, if you will, from the rest of the world at a specific organization means that we can use it to identify what threats are targeting other companies, and if we do business with those companies, we can make a determination about how we want to mitigate that risk going forward.
You bet. And I think, to kind of put a bow on this one, it really is about more effectively prioritizing efforts, right? Most customers, if you think about their extended, or most enterprises, you think about their extended supply chain, you've got thousands, if not tens of thousands of organizations that in some way, shape, or form you're doing business with. All of them will have varying degrees of both being attacked and, kind of competency to protect information that may or may not be, within your environment. Obviously, as we have these increasingly integrated and dependent business processes, this intermingling of data is going to continue to become a much bigger issue. So the importance of really tracking, who is the greatest cesspool of nonsense that I'm doing business with can really help you to understand exactly where you should be focusing your efforts. Because at the end of the day, we don't have enough time, we don't have enough people, we don't have enough money in order to do everything. So we have to choose pretty effectively relative to where we're going to focus our efforts. And again, this is another key aspect that threat intelligence can bring to the table that a lot of folks really don't think about until, again, they get popped the third party.
Yeah, exactly right. And also just, sometimes we gloss over, but just from a pure compliance perspective, right? Oftentimes you have to show compliance in terms of, the due diligence and that you're exercising in terms of securing your supply chain, and secure supply chains have gotten a lot of airplay recently, and this is an example where threat intelligence absolutely can help with securing your supply chain.
Yep. Okay, great. Unauthorized access to digital assets. Let's dig into that one.
Yeah. So this is a really interesting area. I talked about this previously in a couple of different forums. What we're seeing, one of the trends that we're seeing really over the last year or so is kind of a pivot away from using device vulnerabilities to exploit a network to really using compromised account credentials, right? And whether they get those through phishing expeditions or whether they get them by, stealing large databases of account credentials, this use of compromised account credentials, and just to give you a sense, the massive explosion, if you will, in terms of unique usernames and passwords. And so, we, at LookingGlass, one of the things that our threat intelligence group does, our cyber threat intelligence group, and our group of analysts through the different accesses they have in the deep and the dark web, is they curate breach packages of compromised account credentials, of credit card numbers, of social security numbers, right? And we provide those to different folks, whether it's credit card monitoring agencies or customers of ours. But, just to give you a sense of the number, right? About a year ago, we had just over 100 million unique username and password hash combinations that we've curated from different data breach packages. And as of last month, that number has gone up over 2.5 billion unique usernames and password hash combinations that are floating around in the dark web that are either being sold or traded or in other ways used to get into organizations and to access data that those folks who have those credentials aren't authorized to access. And so this is not an example of, hey, I found a vulnerability in a public-facing piece of infrastructure, or I've inserted some malware on your laptop, right, and I've installed a rat, and now I'm going to get access to it and start moving laterally through your network. It is, hey, I have a username and password combination of an employee at your organization, and I'm going to log in, and it's going to look like I'm a legitimate employee with all of the accesses that legitimate employee has. This is a way, though, that we use threat intelligence, and we work with our customers, and on behalf of our customers, use threat intelligence to alert them as well. So one of the services that we provide to our customers is every week or every day, depending on when it shows up, hey, we saw 50 new employees at your domain name, bankxyz.com, credentials show up in a breach package in an underground forum. We'll alert our customers. Our customers will typically go through a password change protocol, alert those employees. They'll also start to figure out, hey, how did their credentials get compromised? Did they go to a phishing site? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But this is a very specific example of how threat intelligence and the curation of breach packages from the locations that those breach packages are being traded. And let's be clear, as much as some people and some companies would like to talk about them having access to the dark web, LookingGlass has been around since 2007, right? And those relationships that have been curated that allow us access to certain locations are not relationships that you can create overnight, because bad guys typically are not trusting or very trusting of other bad guys. But the fact that we have these accesses and these breach packages, and we're able to provide this service to our customers and continuously update them whenever we've seen new compromised account credentials or whenever new credit card numbers are showing up in underground forums, is an example of how threat intelligence very specifically can protect from unauthorized access to digital assets, where in the past, traditional controls like firewalls or IPSs or those types of things wouldn't necessarily catch this, because this looks like legitimate employees coming in to access assets, but it turns out that they're not legitimate employees. They just happen to have credentials that make them look like legitimate employees.
Yep, that's right. And I think a lot of that gets back to, again, this overarching concept we've been discussing about focusing and prioritizing your efforts. And obviously, if you know that there are compromised credentials out there, at some point there's been something went wrong with those devices, or there was some kind of compromise. Again, in a lot of cases, just unbeknownst to the end user that or the employee that ended up being compromised. So again, it's just a way to once again kind of focus your efforts on the stuff that is most impactful to ensure that things are protected.
Right. Yep.
Good. So covert channels in protocol-specific infrastructure like DNS, and this is actually pretty timely, right? Because we did see, at least a portion of the internet, kind of impacted, and obviously it's through a denial of service attack. But it really started to highlight, kind of the brittle nature of the internet in general, and how protocols like and capabilities like DNS really are kind of one of the linchpins for how we do things and how we get to things, and obviously kind of understanding how threat intel can help protect some of those additional protocols would be great.
Yes, so spot on. So if you go to the next slide, and you're right. So the Mirai malware, in addition to like the DNS DDoS attack that botnet waged, if we talk about some things, and this goes back to your earlier question about, do I automatically block? How do I make a determination to automatically block? What we'll talk about here is that, while integration of data feeds and integration of threat intelligence, for lack of a better term, has been being done on firewalls and web gateways and email security appliances for a number of years, something that has kind of gone unserved, if you will, is different protocols that are used essentially in order for the internet to run. And DNS has gotten a lot of airplay. And if we kind of look at that specific malware and really just malware in general, or even phishing campaigns in general, one of the first things that any device does when you type in an address into your web browser, or a piece of malware tries to contact a domain, is it has to resolve that domain to an IP address. And DNS obviously is always open. It needs to be always open so that it can always respond to those resolution requests. And here's a case of where DNS and threat intelligence integrated with DNS, and if you go to the next slide, can actually block the initial resolution of a piece of malware or an infected device, whether it's an Internet of Things device that's been infected, or it's a laptop on my network that's been infected, by integrating threat intelligence into your DNS firewall. You can intercept the resolution of a bad domain. And like I said earlier, these domains are randomly generated, very long domains that are not any location that any person should be going to or would be going to, that I can think of for any legitimate reason, or even devices that are trying to contact back to a server, right? I mean, these are things, and in this example, right, it's badlgcyberdemo2.com, but you can imagine that these domains are very long, randomly generated, just look like a bunch of gobbledygook that nobody would be able to type into a firewall, a DNS firewall or any other firewall. But by preloading these domains into our DNS firewalls, and by getting that information from the threat intelligence that we've curated from the pieces of malware that we've dissected in the domain generation algorithms that we've pulled apart, and loading it up, you can intercept the resolution of that request. And if you go to the next slide, what you'll end up seeing is that now these domains can either be blocked or they can be redirected to some internal sinkhole. But then in the case of, for example, the Mirai malware, all of these IoT devices, and let's spend a minute talking about IoT, right? A lot of people will talk about securing IoT devices, and in a past life, I spent a lot of time at different companies working on IoT security. The challenge with securing IoT devices is they tend to be very inexpensive, and there tends to be a lot of them, and securing devices can be expensive. And the economics, and I think Bruce Schneier had a pretty good blog about this a couple of weeks ago, the economics of securing IoT devices just aren't there. But something you can do to protect IoT devices in the future is to limit their ability to resolve the domains of bad pieces of code that may get installed on those devices, or bad domains associated with malware, so that they can't redirect and receive the tasking information from the command and control servers that those domains are addressing. And so then if you go to the next slide, right, if you insert threat intelligence into your DNS protocol specific firewall and you intercept the resolution of a domain from a device, and again, it can be any device, that malware that's resident on that domain, and it's trying to contact its command and control server through a channel that has historically always been open because it has to be open, like DNS. By integrating threat intelligence, we can intercept that resolution, redirect it or block it, and prevent those compromised devices from ever reaching their command and control server. Doing two things. Both the command and control server never knows that those devices are awake and active and ready to participate in that botnet. And two, those devices are effectively, quarantined or rendered ineffective because they can't receive any tasking information from those C2 servers because they don't know that they're awake. So this is a very specific example of where integrating threat intelligence, and I know that there's a lot of concern about automatically mitigating or blocking some things. This is not going to cause the CEO to not be able to get to the SharePoint site or to be able to get to his Box account or to be able to get anywhere else. This very specifically would keep an infected device from contacting its command and control server and participating in a botnet, and potentially would have had would have provided some help in terms of responding to that attack that took down the internet a couple weeks ago.
Yeah, you bet, and this obviously fits right into the bucket of active controls that we were talking about from a use case standpoint. And again, I mean, I think it really is about giving employees kind of the ability to save themselves from themselves, I guess, right? Because a lot of folks don't think about it. I mean, it's funny. I just, this morning I got an email from somebody who said, Securosis sued me. I've never even visited your site. It's just like, oh, are you kidding me? Right? And it's just because these are unsuspecting people and they just click on stuff, right? And if they had something like this, that it was just like, okay, that's a bad site and we know it's bad and this guy's never been to Securosis.com and, obviously this is, some kind of malware. That again kind of makes employees who really don't care much about security, besides kind of getting through whatever CBT computer-based training they have to check their box every year. It really does kind of help protect them from a lot of the ills that are out there that again these folks just aren't in a position to defend themselves against.
That's right.
So so let's kind of bridge it in and wrap up at least kind of the more detailed use case piece of it, by talking about the existing security infrastructure, right? And I think that almost everybody can agree that we don't do a good enough job with the millions and sometimes tens of millions, and if you're a Fortune 10 bank, hundreds of millions of dollars that have been spent on kind of an enterprise security control. So how can threat intel really make those tools more effective?
Yeah, so this goes back to your point about sharing, right? If you go to the next slide, regardless of whether you share threat intelligence with an existing security product or security control, and we've talked a lot about sharing threat intelligence feeds with web gateways or firewalls or even email security appliances to protect against phishing. But the fact of the matter is a number of customers are purchasing SIMs or other types of log management systems, and they're using them as their single panes of glass, right, to conduct their investigations, to do their pivoting, right? You have to and this is something at LookingGlass we believe very, very strongly in, right? It's kind of one of our fundamental tenets, if you will, that everything you can do in the UI, you can do through the API in our products, and that you can get the data out of our products via a well-structured API format in order to put into other products and to integrate with other products, because we can't expect all of the training and all of the money that companies have invested in their people and their processes and technology We can't necessarily expect them to shift their eyeballs to a new pane of glass and learn a new pane of glass, right? There's things that they know how to use, that they like using, that are integrated into their processes, and you have to be able to integrate with those capabilities, and ultimately really increase the effectiveness and increase the efficiency of the investments that companies have already made in their people, processes, and technology. And that's something that we believe very firmly in, because it's only by sharing threat intelligence, either sharing it with other machines through machine-readable threat intelligence, or being able to share it with other communities, right? So whether it's sticks and taxi support, or whether it's being able to, create finished intelligence that can be shared with a human in human-readable format or human-readable prose that can be floated up the chain, because to your earlier point as well, we have a responsibility to market, some of these things as well, and whether a CISO gets a report every month that he walks into the board meeting that says, we were targeted by these threat actor groups in the last month, and they were using these variants of malware, and we've successfully mitigated these attacks on our organization, or whether on a daily basis that information gets fed into their SIMs so that their incident responders or their security operations folks can see in real time, what the outside-in view is. These are all ways that threat intelligence, assuming that you have an eye towards integrating with the existing investments that have been made, again, in the people, processes, and technology, and at LookingGlass we absolutely do. But that if you do, and if companies are doing business with a vendor that does, it absolutely can increase the effectiveness of their existing security infrastructure by providing that correlation.
You bet, and I think that's really kind of the basis for why a programmatic approach is so critical. I mean, again, you can throw data in here, you can throw data in there, but really leveraging threat intel as a key aspect of a security program really allows you to use the data in the most effective means where it is going to be most impactful. Again, kind of turning that data into true intelligence to make everybody, smarter, make the existing controls more effective, make the existing monitors better at really understanding what's happening within the environment on a contextual basis, and really just making everything flow better. And that's kind of what we're trying to get to through the use of threat intel, and really considering it a key aspect of, I'd say the next evolution of where security practice needs to go. And that really is about sharing. It really is about, kind of communicating success and a lot of those softer issues that tend to be less, hey, let's block some stuff and beat down some bad guys and gals, right? And much more about, what do I have to do to make this into a real business practice within my organization? So with that, let's kind of hit on a couple of things and revisit a number of the topics that we've already discussed. So, when we're thinking about gathering the threat intel, obviously who your potential adversaries are become a key aspect of that, right? I mean, if you're a financial institution, obviously financial fraud is going to be a key aspect of that, and there are certain actors that specialize in those types of attacks, so learning all you can about them to understand what their typical tactics are, what types of tools they use, how to best defend yourself, all becomes instrumental in, again, increasing the effectiveness and the efficiency of your security program. And obviously, you'll get into a buy versus a build type of discussion when you're thinking about aggregating a lot of this data, and where do you put it, because that becomes a key decision point, because there's a lot of different information out there. There's a lot of open source stuff. There are a lot of commercial organizations that can certainly bring forward a number of different, data feeds that can, in fact, help, or in some cases, overly complicate what it is that you're doing. So again, thinking about threat intel from a very strategic programmatic standpoint kind of leads you down the path of what data is going to be the most effective in terms of furthering your goals, where I should store this data, what kind of pre-processing I should do on it, how I should be integrating it into a lot of the, again, whether they're monitors or active controls that you have in place. Again, a lot of these decisions kind of, they'll make themselves, but they certainly are a lot easier when you really take a more strategic view of how threat intel is going to impact your security program. So then, AJ alluded to, and I've talked a number of times about the importance of communicating what threat intel brings to your program, right? Why pat yourself on the back? And I know a lot of technology people and certainly security folks in general tend to not like to, toot their own horn or, kind of blow smoke in certain places because they think that's, hey, this is what I'm doing, right? This is my job. This is what I'm paid to do. But remember, we're really thinking about a different way of doing security. Remember, the historical nature of security is to be inclusive and to be very protected about what you do. I don't want to give the adversaries any information about my control set or what it is that I'm doing from a defensive standpoint, because then they'll know how to attack me. Well, the good news is a couple of years ago we started overcoming that resistance just based upon the reality that the adversary already knows what it is that you're doing, and in a lot of cases they've already beaten down your defenses and they're actively messing around in your environment. And I think that what we found is through necessity, a lot of folks really realized that they had to share information more effectively. They had to embrace the fact that they could learn from other organizations, and that kind of pushed this different way of thinking, which again required some means of persuasion internally. And that's what really communicating success is about. It's about getting a quick win. Maybe it is blocking malware. Maybe it is, that DNS firewall example that AJ talked about relative to protecting employees from themselves, because they're just trying to do their job and they end up in bad places. And if there's some way to stop that ahead of time, that's obviously in everybody's best interest. So it's getting those quick wins, but also talking about how am I going to instrument my process to understand, and my program to understand how threat intelligence is really providing sustainable value to my environment. Maybe it's just a matter of how many different things have I blocked, although that ceases to become interesting after a little while. But it really is about effectiveness in prioritizing and reducing that window between when you do have a compromised device and when you know and detect and identify those compromised devices. So there are ways to instrument kind of the program, the existing controls in your monitors to show the impact of threat intelligence. And again, we can't highlight that enough to have consistent reporting and visualization of the impact of threat intel so that you can communicate, so that ultimately when you get time, and right about now, right, it's about budget time in a lot of organizations. If not, you're potentially being already through that process, you have to go back and say, hey, this is why we need to continue to maintain this infrastructure. This is why we need to continue to invest in these data sources and these intelligence feeds because they've had an impact on what it is that we do. So if you don't, if you're not really kind of paying attention to that, you're kind of missing a key aspect of what should be a strategic programmatic approach to the environment. So then let's kind of hit on this next topic, which is really sharing. Should you share your intel? I think we've already made the case that everything is really kind of predicated upon, paying it forward, right? And learning from both others and teaching and instructing organizations where you can. But obviously you want to do it in a secure fashion, right? You don't want to just pump out all of the attacks and malware signatures that you have found internally within your environment, and just again kind of willy-nilly start to just post this stuff on shared boards and maybe within your kind of regional or industry ISAC or what have you, right? You want to do it and make sure that you're doing it in a secure fashion so your proprietary telemetry, your proprietary information is protected, but you're also able to get the information to the folks that really need it. So again, just kind of keep in mind the fact that, yep, we really want to share in, as aggressive means as we can, but we have to do it within the constructs of what security and privacy thresholds you'll have in-house. And again, I would recommend that you talk to whatever vendor you're evaluating relative to threat intelligence, because they will certainly have ideas, if not mechanisms, to share what you're finding in your environment with the rest of their broader network so that everybody gets smarter. So with that, here are a bunch of things that you can find, certainly from Securosis, and I know, I'm sure AJ has some other, links that they'll send to you later on. But, kind of check out our blog. That's where we do all of our research. We've got a research library that has probably 100 plus research papers. So if you have a problem sleeping, download a few of those, and I guarantee you will be out cold pretty quickly. No, I'm just kidding on that.
Blogs sound like my blogs.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. But, the thing that we do ask is we don't charge you to access any of the research that we do, but if you could provide some feedback to us to, especially if we're off the mark on some things, which does happen from time to time, help us make our research smarter. So that's really the deal that we make relative to, again, just trying to make everybody smarter, have everybody provide some infrastructure that and information that I think you can leverage in your day-to-day job. So with that, AJ, why don't you kind of take us home and wrap things up? And again, I think it's been a pretty good, productive discussion.
Yeah, I agree. And thanks, Mike, obviously for your time. And folks, thank you for taking the time to listen. Similarly, you can go to LookingGlassCyber.com. You see our URL down there in the corner. We have a lot of white papers. I believe we just put out a white paper with you, Mike, working with Securosis. But there's a bunch of other blogs, research. Certainly, folks, if you have any questions for me after this, and it looks like we did have a couple questions come in. Maybe we have time to take a question. But if we don't get to your questions, certainly feel free to ping me after the fact. Like I said, you can go to LookingGlassCyber.com, send an email in. It will definitely make its way to me. I love talking about this stuff. So, certainly encourage you to follow up. Mike, do we have time for a question or two? Do we want to take one?
I think we do. I think we can do a couple. Okay. Yeah, that sounds great.
Sure. Okay, yeah, I see one here. It says, I would love to give your thoughts and get your thoughts, and I can certainly give my perspective. How can you tell if a vendor's threat intelligence platform will provide the appropriate coverage? I guess basically, how can you tell a good threat intelligence vendor from one who won't provide comprehensive intel?
Ooh, that actually is a good one. And it gets back to our general approach to procuring almost anything, kind of security, product, service, et cetera. And that has to do with seeing how it actually impacts your day-to-day environment. And a lot of that has everything to do with trying it out. Right, so if you have a threat intel platform, obviously a lot of these, some are on site, but a lot of them are kind of run in cloud-based environments. So there really isn't a lot of impact to trying it out, pumping some data in, seeing how it impacts your environment, doing some very cursory integrations with some of those monitors and active controls that we were talking about, and doing a proof of concept just to make sure that you're going to get the value over time. Because again, I think that a lot of it gets back to what's going to work in your environment. And just because the vendor has interesting data doesn't mean you or your organization can really leverage that data in the most effective means. So I think the only way is really to try a lot of, or at least a handful of these tools based upon what makes the most sense. And the other thing I'll point out is, it would be a little disingenuous if we sat here and talked about sharing information and the importance of getting smarter from people that without saying, when you're talking about buying anything, you can get smarter from the people that you know. So ask your friends, right? There are folks in your industry, there are folks, kind of locally that you may know from some security working groups or from some local environments and groups that you're involved in. See what they're using, see what vendors work for them, because again, that usually is a pretty good place to find out, because your buddies, unless you're buying them beer all the time, aren't going to lie to you too much. So they'll give you, they'll give you the skinny in terms of what works and what doesn't work.
Yeah, so I agree with you. One thing that I want to touch on that you mentioned there, and we have a litmus test here at LookingGlass, that basically for threat data to become threat intelligence, it has to meet two criteria. It has to be relevant and it has to be actionable. And so specifically, you can tell a good threat intelligence vendor from one who won't provide comprehensive intel, because that threat intelligence vendor can make the intelligence relevant to your specific care-abouts, whether it's the supply chain or the third parties you want to monitor or your organization, and it has to be actionable, i.e. an indicator of compromise from 3 months ago probably isn't all that relevant to you versus one that may be from 3 hours or 3 minutes ago. So one of the things, again, that we provide, and I'm sure that there's other vendors in the market that can provide this as well, but I would suggest that anybody listening ask their vendors if they can. We can tell you specifically which 5 of the 5 or 10 million indicators that are in our system on any given day, what are the 10 in the last hour that targeted your organization? Or of the 50 million things that have been said about your company on the surface web, deep web, or dark web, i.e. in the open source community, what are the 15 or 20 that are talking about, hey, we don't like your company, or we're going to do something bad? And so that relevancy and that actionability, we believe is key to evaluating one vendor from another vendor. So it looks like we're just about out of time. We don't have time for another question, so I guess we'll wrap it up. Mike, it's always a pleasure spending time and discussing this with you. Thank you so much.
It is. You bet, A.J. I've had fun, and hopefully everybody else, as you had mentioned. Thank you to everybody else who listened to us, kind of commiserate a little bit about, where things need to go. But again, I can't, kind of stress highly enough the, kind of impact that a structured strategic threat intelligence program can have on a security program. So, yep, I know there's a lot of competing interests. I know there's a lot of shiny objects that folks want to change, but what we've seen through our research, as well as through just seeing, a lot of the impact of threat intel, we do think that this is something that pretty much every organization should be looking at in some way, shape, or form.
All right. Thank you.